I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, CNN is suing the White House, and specifically President Trump, Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, as well as John Kelly, the chief of staff, and a Secret Service agent who removed the secure press pass from Jim Acosta, the White House correspondent. Now, Bill, does not mean that CNN is banned from the White House. After all, there are some 50 people who have White House passes from CNN to be able to access the White House and cover the news. However, CNN is claiming, backed by Ted Olson, by the way, famous attorney that most people in America know, that Ted Olson is basically claiming on behalf of CNN that First Amendment rights are being deprived of this supposedly free press. And Bill, you got to ask yourself, if you're a conservative, even if you don't like Jim Acosta or CNN, don't you have to stand up and say, hey, President Trump, you need to be able to take those tough questions, even if the guy's obnoxious, because we are built upon freedom of the press here.
Well, I don't think Donald Trump has exactly been able to avoid taking tough questions during his 2 years in office, Scott. So whenever I get to questions like this, I start asking myself some fundamentals. Do I have a right to publish my opinion on my website or in these videos? Do I get to speak my mind and put them out there freely, yes or no? And the answer, thanks especially to our members, is yes. So my freedom of speech is not being impinged. Now, the question becomes, can I go to one of those press briefings in the White House? Am I allowed to go?
Theoretically, you could apply for press credentials.
But could I walk in?
No. You just don't walk
okay,
in.
So you apply for credentials, and then these credentials are granted to you, and probably on this basis of the size of your paper.
And they try to spread the love around. I mean, there
sure,
are some bloggers
who
have local papers.
So here's my point. I can't walk into that press conference by myself as an individual who's got a First Amendment right to publish whatever I want to. That press conference is a privilege. It's not a right. The right to report and the right to speak your mind and the right to criticize the president is not being restricted here. What's being restricted here is the behavior of one individual who over a course of time has shown himself to be so rabidly unprofessional that I don't think he deserves to be in the press corps. I think he deserves to be in the peanut gallery where he belongs, chewing popcorn and flinging poo. That seems to be what Jim Acosta is all about. So if you want to make this so personal that you can't behave in a professional fashion, then I wouldn't be surprised if the adults say, well, you don't get to sit at the big boy table anymore. And if you want to say that's a restriction of freedom of speech, you're out of your mind.
Well, Bill, doesn't this just lead to a slippery slope where maybe a future Democratic president could actually pick and choose the media they want in the room?
You mean like Barack Obama did for 8 years, or Hillary Clinton or someone? Yeah, listen, Scotty, you can't equate the two, because you're talking about the press as if it was an unbiased organ of society, which is what it was supposed to be. But when you ask a question, what happened? Well, wouldn't it be terrible if a Democratic president? Let's just stop right there. The press corps is the audiovisual department for the Democratic Party. So it's pointless to talk about whether or not a Democratic president would be able to pick his audience, because they're already picked. Every single one of them are pre-selected to agree with everything that the Democratic candidate says. So if you're going to be so combative that you're willing to put aside the truth and not report on some stories, report on others, bury others, then you have to be treated like a partisan, which is what Jim Acosta is. And I suspect that Donald Trump ran out of patience with Jim Acosta's attitude and asked him to please do not attend this in the future. Has he limited Jim Acosta's ability to report? You could say he's limited some access to the information. But, Scott, as we know, I'm pretty sure these things are recorded, are they not, press conferences?
Yes, they are, and there's at least a pool photographer there at all times.
So there is an ongoing video record of pretty much every press conference, right? Because I've seen clips from every press conference there's been, right? So there's a video record, yes?
They have some gaggles that are off the record that are not allowed to have cameras or recording devices, but by and large, yes.
Off the record is a gentleman's agreement, and it's pretty clear that Jim Acosta is not a gentleman on this score, and neither is Donald Trump for that matter, and that's why he's president. That's why he has to be president. So if you're telling me that Jim Acosta's First Amendment rights to report have been violated by the fact that he's not in the room when the video recording is being made, and he has to wait for 4 or 5 minutes after the session is over in order to get the exact same information he would have had by privilege earlier, then I don't think that's a particularly compelling case.
Bill, I could make the argument very easily that there has never been an unbiased press in this country. In fact, you have made the argument in the past that back, 150, 200 years ago, most major towns were marked by the presence of a lot of newspapers, all of which had their political opinions. You knew that was the Republican paper, that's the Democrat paper, that's the Communist paper. You knew what you were dealing with. So why is it suddenly now important that we marginalize particular individuals just because they have an obnoxious point of view? You yourself have previously defended the need to allow the worst of the worst in journalism to be able to have the freedom to speak and to report.
Well, there's two arguments there. The first one is the argument of multiple press angles on a story, because I don't think you can eliminate bias in reporting as a general rule. We did a segment just a little while ago about bias in science. Bias is part of the human condition. I'm biased, you're biased, progressives are biased, everybody's biased. We're biased because we have evidence in our lives that convince us that this viewpoint of ours is correct, and that tends us to want to agree with some things and disagree with others. So the argument about multiple press sources, meaning that Jim Acosta should keep his press pass, it doesn't really bear weight, because you're not dealing with a balanced press corps. You're not dealing with a 50-50 press corps. You're not dealing with an 80-20 press corps. You're not dealing with an 90-10 press corps. And you're not even really dealing with a 95-5% press corps. You're dealing with 97-98% of the people in that room. In fact, I know I've read a study that said that every single one of the people in that room, every single one of them voted Democrat. So there's no balance there. There's no pretension of balance. So I'm not going to buy the argument that we should have balanced reporting, because we don't have balanced reporting.
No, I'm actually making the argument that we don't have balanced reporting, and therefore the president has to live with the media that exists.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't have to live with the media that exists. That's the trap that every single other Republican president has fallen into since the mass media age, when Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, who basically lost the Vietnam War in an evening, who, by the way, was a member of a one world society, and upon his graduation, after he left CBS, he accepted an award saying that the United States essentially should be a post office address, and that we should be the first in the world to basically renounce our sovereignty. So this kind of thing goes back a long way. And you do not have to accept the press that you're given, which is why the main reason that Donald Trump is president, and continues to be president for that matter, is because of Twitter. So imagine the shock on the faces of the progressives who use this as a form of basically just sniping at each other when they're bored. Because what Twitter does is it allows the president of the United States to make an end run around the bias filter that's put there by the mainstream media. And so if you're telling me that there's this horrendous bias filter and we have to accept it, what I'm telling you is we have to accept the bias reporting in terms of the freedom of the press to report what they want to, but we do not have to accept the bias in terms of the privilege that we extend to individuals to attend the press conference in person.
Bill, about 2.5 million Americans watch the cable news networks. It's a tiny slice of the number of people in this country.
Yep.
President Trump probably has more followers than that, I'm assuming, on Twitter. The CNN is now mounting a constitutional challenge using an attorney who has argued before the Supreme Court. They plan to take this as far as they can do it. Why not, if you're President Trump, be a bigger man than this and say, you know what, it doesn't really matter what happens at the presidential press conference. Doesn't it make him look weak when he kicks this guy out rather than deals with him face to face?
I don't think it makes him look weak. It doesn't make him look presidential, but if he were to be presidential, he wouldn't be president. So this is the world we live in, Scott. And these are the cards that we're dealt. The argument that you should continue to take slaps in the face ad infinitum because of your superior morality and your superior, seasoning and perspective and balance and all of that is not an argument that I would personally want to have tested on me. If I got hit in the face often enough, there would come a point when I'd start to get a little annoyed by it. And I suspect that if it continued for 2 or 3 years, I might become annoyed enough about it to say, I think we ought to stop this.
But that's not how you would play that, Bill. But that's not how President Trump has played it.
But that doesn't matter.
President Trump told him to shut up and sit down.
He should shut up and sit down, because he asked his question, And then he asked a follow-up question, which was not his prerogative, and then he kept going and going and going and going. So when somebody is violating the rules of decorum that accompany that press pass, and they simply decide to turn this into a soapbox for their personal crusade against the president, we're not reporting anymore. Now we're grandstanding. And when somebody's grandstanding, what you need to do is you need to tell them to shut up and sit down.
Ladies and gentlemen, shut up is something we never do here at BillWhittle.com. Although
I'm not saying CNN should shut up. I'm saying that the presidential press conference is a privilege that is accorded to individuals in the press. The actual proceedings and the information that is disseminated in that conference is made available to the entire world immediately. And to suggest that because your ability to be on one side of the door as opposed to the other side of the door is restricting your freedom of speech, your freedom of reporting, is a pretty clear misunderstanding of what speech and reporting and personal privilege really is.
You know, I was going to wrap it here, but let me ask one more question.
Sure.
Bill, you're now in the, you're a person with a press pass, and you're in the Obama White House, and you're in that briefing room, and you start to ask a hostile question to President Obama or one of his staff people. It really doesn't matter. And you try to follow up on that question, and he tells you that you're being rude and then you should sit down. Do you quietly sit down and say, "Yes, sir, Mr. President," and then never raise your voice about it later? Or do you feel like you're being shut down by the heavy hand of executive power?
Scott, that's assuming that this is the first time that Jim Acosta has ever been in the press room ever, and that he's just one of 50 other people, and Donald Trump just randomly decided he didn't like the guy and told him to sit down and shut up. So to answer your question, if I asked President Obama a tough question and I tried to ask a follow-up and he moved on to someone else, I would sit down and I would write in my personal report on this story that I had my answer by the fact that he wouldn't answer the question. And if I continuously pushed him, if he kept saying, I've answered that question, next question, but Mr. President, if I did that again and again and again, and he told me to sit down and shut up, well, then I would deserve it because I had violated the terms of the agreement.
Ladies and gentlemen, the terms of the agreement here at BillWhittle.com are that our members will contribute to the dispersing of these kind of conversations around the world, and they do that voluntarily. They don't even have to be told. We don't have to command them. We don't involuntarily take it from them.
As a matter of fact, we seem to accidentally make things as difficult for them as possible, but nevertheless, they stay with us.
These are the kind of people who will fight for their right to be members at BillWhittle.com, and we appreciate that. If you'd like to become one of those proud patriots, the citizen producers here, you can find out more information at BillWhittle.com. In the meantime, until next time, I'm Scott Ott. This is Bill Whittle, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Thanks to those members at BillWhittle.com for making that possible.